Hello everyone. What follows will be the first in a series in which I will discuss the most effective ways to conduct oneself when engaging with social justice activists in public, both on the street and on social media. We live in interesting times, to say the least, and while the recent election of Donald Trump as president has shown that the numbers are not as overwhelmingly in favor of social justice as was previously believed, social justice activists of the more toxic kind now have the benefit of having a powerful enemy within the highest echelon of power in the Western world to frame themselves against. And make no mistake, while we did learn that a little under half of America's population chose to weather charges of racism and misogyny to elect Trump, we also learned that over half of the country's population voted against him. Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, even if only by a slim margin. Thus, the numbers are still unknown enough that we who are pushing back against the excesses of social justice ideologues can still very conceivably make all of the same strategic blunders that led up to Trump being able to win the presidential election. And so it behooves us to consider seriously what those blunders were, so we don't hand our enemies the same victory they so recently handed to us. And so to inaugurate this series, I would like to introduce our first episode of Surviving Social Justice, entitled, Learn from Your Enemy's Mistakes. Let's start by briefly grounding our analysis with a consideration of where social justice warriors come from. Speaking in extremely rough terms, politically interested professors with non-traditional values very cleverly set out to change the political landscape to their favor by slowly taking over university faculties, by indoctrinating students so that they endorse their pet political and social projects. But even though many of these causes were actually respectable, for instance the legalization of same-sex marriage, they also neglected to teach these students how to reason, argue, and act rationally and effectively. This wasn't always an oversight, of course. Some of these professors cynically realized that this was helpful in the short term, because these students would have neither the tools nor the sense to question what their teachers were telling them. And as a result, in the short term, the political groups favored by these professors gained veritable armies of activists that self-perpetuated and grew through increasingly entrenched and insulated departments at liberal universities. The problem begins when the introduction of social media like Twitter and Facebook dispersed organizational authority to anyone with a large enough contact list, so that public activism and outcry could take place everywhere at once and at a radically increased rate. This meant that from now on, it was the general mood of the activist masses themselves, and not rational professors or thinkers, that determined the tenor of social justice activism. In short, the professors have lost control of the beast they created, and can now only watch with fingers crossed while it zigzags like a bull through the proverbial china shop, and with no rational head save what dirty money could buy, this intellectually unequipped mass has shown itself to be almost endlessly susceptible to the most ridiculous excesses. The result was that even though their more disciplined forebears had managed to ideologically conquer almost every institution within our society, through their recklessness, overconfidence, and intemperance, their students became so obnoxious to their neighbors, classmates, and fellow citizens that they have thus far destroyed the credibility of these causes effectively in the eyes of the public, and are now besieged at every institutional level by an awakened counter-movement, which culminated most recently in the election of Donald Trump. As of now, nobody on the outside really cares what they say, think, or do anymore. Social justice activism has come to be seen by the general public as, at best, disruptive and embarrassing, and at worst, a threat to society. There are a few takeaways from this that, for this introductory video, I'm going to condense into 3 basic rules, which, if you've ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, will seem somewhat familiar. The first rule is know thyself. Humility, temperance, and discrimination are indispensable attributes when engaging in any kind of contentious matter in public. If you don't have these, instead of rushing recklessly into the fray, it would perhaps be better to spend time cultivating these in private and saving your energies and reputation for a future engagement. you will likely do more harm than good for your side by thrusting yourself into public battles unprepared. Knowing when and when not to engage, knowing that you are able to stay cool in the midst of a heated discussion while being observed by an audience, and understanding the limits of your own mental and rhetorical abilities are absolutely essential to success in any contentious political engagement. To engage without these qualities is to gamble with both your reputation and those of your allies. The second rule is know the terrain. Remember that the immediate aim of a cultural struggle is to win the sympathies of your audience, not your opponents. Thus, appearing to be better informed than your opponents is at least as important to success as actually being as informed as your opponent. And the truth is, there is no reliable way to cheat here. When engaging with ideas with which you profoundly disagree, it can be easy to not do your due diligence and research the issues they purport to address. But while it might seem sufficient to you to point out that something is obviously just a manifestation of cultural Marxist ideology, for example, most outsiders will not see it this way. And if you are not familiar with the current thinking and terminology surrounding an issue, your opponents who have spent years of their lives thinking about it will have a very easy time making you look like an ignorant fool simply by pointing to your own demonstrated lack of awareness. It is not enough to know in your own heart how bad these ideas are. You need to outclass your opponent even on their own terms, and ideally to such a degree that an audience will recognize simply by your own mastery of the issue who is the better informed. There is simply no way around this. If you are going to debate a feminist or a critical theorist, you must have at least a passing understanding of the current state of their field, or you may be taken to the woodshed without even realizing it. Which leads us to the third and final rule. Know thy enemy. Those who today attempt to engage in contentious political discourse, either in the classroom or on the street, can easily be made to feel like a mouse dropped into a tank of piranhas. Social justice warriors, as a derogatory term, exists to identify a kind of political activist that demonstrates a decided absence of honor in their public dealings. Therefore, don't expect your opponents to have any scruples about flouting debate etiquette in order to score a cheap point. Call-out culture, no platforming, feigned pathos, and vocal discrimination based on race, gender, or orientation, not uncommonly while also being outnumbered, can not just put you on the back foot, but can also be psychologically and emotionally jarring. Be aware that while many social justice activists engage in these tactics automatically, they were originally trained to do so, and for a reason. Even though the social causes underlying it are in some cases quite valid, social justice activism has primarily perpetuated itself through social pressure, not persuasive argument, and even the most sincere and well-informed of your opponents will more often than not reflexively resort to these tactics without even being aware of what they are doing. And even if they become aware, know that they are unlikely to publicly bear the shame of admitting this for your sake. Recognize that the purpose of these actions is to disarm a better informed opponent without having to engage that opponent directly, and more importantly, to make that opponent appear weak and indecisive to onlookers, or alternatively to make them look bitter, angry, and irrational. This is what you need to avoid at all costs, and thus I list this rule last because strict adherence to the first two rules is absolutely essential. Their goal is to provoke a compromising response from you, and they will go to extraordinary lengths to get it. Knowing that this is the game they are playing, know that it can sometimes be far more effective, especially if you find yourself overwhelmed by numbers or simply unprepared to engage vocally, to simply remain silent, and let their own escalating attempts to elicit a reaction from you succeed only in giving others a bad impression of themselves, thus ceding you the victory without you having to fire a single shot in return. Take the long view, and recognize that seeming to lose a debate is a small price to pay for winning the sympathies of the majority in the long run. There lies power. While it can be easy to be intimidated by their ability to summon crowds of equally zealous friends to gang up on you, actual social justice warriors are really quite rare. They only have the appearance of an overwhelming majority because they consist of the rejects from almost every demographic in society. These are individuals with no merit to serve them in a meritocracy, and no rhetorical skill to serve them in a democracy, and thus their only hope for success lies with the movement. Never deny them an opportunity to demonstrate these qualities. That being said, a caveat. Be very careful not to confuse honest people with sincere progressive values for the more vicious kind of activist I have been referring to throughout this video, just because they use a lot of the same lingo. They aren't necessarily the same thing. I will discuss further how to distinguish a social justice warrior from a simple progressive in a future video, but for now be reminded that this latter group are part of the people you are trying to win over. And by picking fights with people who are not your enemies, you are in fact doing your enemies' work for them and turning people to their cause who would otherwise have been at worst neutral bystanders. In conclusion, remember that a culture war is not won by convincing your opponents, which you are unlikely able to accomplish in any significant numbers anyways, but rather you win by gaining the sympathies of the majority. Follow these rules, which more often than not consist of no more than being a temperate gentleman, and more often than not, you will find yourself winning the sympathies and approval of onlookers, while leaving your opponents looking like vicious fools. More importantly, however, your victory will be a true victory. You will have won through moderation and through having superior reason, learning, manners, and timing, and by embodying and promoting these qualities, you will not have simply won the culture war, but you will have improved that culture by cultivating and promoting a virtuous character and a temperate disposition. And if any social justice activists happen to be watching this, by all means please appropriate the tactics I have explained in this series for yourself. It can only make things better for everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this helpful, or at the very least entertaining. And if you did, please leave a like, and look forward to the next video in this series, which should be coming sometime next week. Thank you.